Before we get into this, just take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you value history that actually teaches something useful. And since the season fits the subject perfectly, Merry Christmas to you and yours. What follows is a reminder that some of the most hard-earned knowledge in human history was set aside not because it failed, but because the world changed. World War II forced millions of soldiers and civilians into survival conditions that were not hypothetical, not recreational, and not optional. Cold, hunger, darkness, and exhaustion were daily realities. Out of that pressure came methods that worked consistently across environments. What's strange is not that these methods existed, but that so many were deliberately abandoned once the war ended. The reason wasn't inefficiency. It was convenience politics and the belief that modern systems would never fail again. One of the first methods to disappear was disciplined darkness management. During the war, blackout navigation was a core survival skill. Soldiers and civilians learned to move through buildings, streets, and terrain without light, using memorized layouts, tactile markers, and faint shielded glow references that never projected outward. This reduced detection, preserved night vision, and prevented accidents when power was unavailable. After the war, electrification expanded rapidly. Darkness was reframed as a problem to eliminate, not a condition to master. Civil defense training faded. Homes were redesigned around constant illumination. The skill of moving confidently without light vanished within a generation. Not because it stopped working, but because people assumed they would never need it again. Another method quietly abandoned was cold weather heat discipline. WWII soldiers learned quickly that staying warm was not about insulation alone, it was about moisture control, movement pacing, and heat retention through posture and shelter design. Men were taught to stop before sweating, vent clothing early, eat frequently, and sleep in positions that minimized heat loss to the ground. After the war, life shifted. Central heating and synthetic insulation became the norm. Suddenly, cold was something you dressed for, not something you managed in your daily routines. So, modern advice, more often than not, focuses on gear and kind of overlooks the behavioral discipline that actually kept soldiers alive when resupply just wasn't possible. The old methods weren't really obsolete, they just weren't convenient anymore. Food sourcing skills, well, they followed the same pattern. During the war, both soldiers and civilians were constantly supplementing their rations. Fishing line, for example, was tucked away in sewing kits. People would improvise traps from bits of wire. Foraging knowledge spread fast, honestly, because calories mattered more than any doctrine. In occupied territories, knowing how to quietly extract a bit of protein could quite literally mean survival. After the war, industrial food systems really took off and became stable. Hunger faded for much of the developed world. Foraging and trapping, well, those were reframed as primitive or even unnecessary. The knowledge survived here and there, in rural communities, among veterans, and tucked away in old manuals. But it pretty much vanished from mainstream preparedness thinking. It wasn't abandoned because it failed. It was left behind because, simply put, supermarkets worked. Fire use also changed dramatically. During the Second World War, training emphasized low signature heat, not flame. Fires were shielded, downsized, or avoided entirely. Soldiers learned how to trap body heat, share warmth, and use residual heat sources rather than relying on visible fires that drew attention or, consumed precious fuel. After the war, survival culture really started to romanticize firemaking instead. The spark became symbolic, while fire management was, well, pretty much ignored. That old lesson, that fire was often a liability, was inconvenient in a world no longer worried about detection or rationing fuel. Navigation skills suffered a similar fate. Soldiers in the Second World War were trained to navigate by terrain, timing, slope, and environmental cues. Compasses failed, maps were outdated or destroyed. Units that survived learned to read land intuitively. After the war, navigation was increasingly delegated to vehicles, infrastructure, and eventually electronics. When GPS arrived, the skill collapsed almost overnight, not because the old methods were inferior, but because technology removed the immediate need to practice them. The problem, as history keeps reminding us, is that systems fail faster than skills decay. Perhaps the most important abandoned method was psychological discipline. WWII survival training emphasized routine, restraint, and calm under deprivation. Soldiers were taught to conserve energy, limit decision-making, and avoid unnecessary action. Survival wasn't framed as heroism, it was framed as endurance. Modern survival culture often flips that script. It emphasizes action, acquisition, and, constant readiness. The quiet wartime lesson that doing less often keeps you alive longer doesn't really sell well in a consumer-driven world. So why were these methods abandoned? Well, because they required practice instead of purchases, because they assumed disruption instead of stability, and because post-war societies wanted to believe that the conditions which created them would never return. History suggests otherwise. These World War II survival methods were not lost because they stopped working. They were set aside because, frankly, modern life made them uncomfortable to remember. Yet when systems strain during blackouts, disasters, or conflict, people rediscover the same principles under pressure. That is why studying them matters, not to romanticize hardship, but to understand what actually sustains humans when comfort disappears. If you found value in this kind of grounded history, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who thinks progress made old knowledge irrelevant. History doesn't work that way, and it never has.